There's the indigenous way, and then there's the scientific way. And we really need to work together in order to see the world as a whole. I want to take that one step further. So instead of two-eyed seeing, I see that we need multi-eyed seeing, because it's not just science and indigenous knowledge that's important. All of us have a role to play.
This is Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and I'm your host, Richard Weiss. Scratch the surface of an explorer and you'll find an adventure and a great story. This show is about their tales. This podcast is a proud supporter of the Explorers Club and the EC50 initiative, 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about. For more information, go to explorers.org. I'm going to start with a quote today. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. And we will understand only what we're taught. And this is by a Senegalese conservationist. And the reason I bring that up, not only does it apply to our next guest, but the term conservation or sustainability, for whatever reason, it seems like it has either a lukewarm or a negative response to it. You've seen a lot of the negative response, especially in American politics. And I was at the Explorers Club yesterday, and I was speaking to some of the staff members. And again, part of the mission of the Explorers Club is to promote exploration and science. Conservation is very big. And the much younger generation at the Explorers Club, who are their staff there, said that they felt that the term conservation was associated with restricting oneself. Someone else said it was overused. I've noticed that it's perceived as an elitism type of term, like, yes, you're going to go get your electric car and they're very expensive. And, I guess last of all, it's kind of like doom and gloom messaging. Well, joining us is Dr. Natalie Schmitt. She's a true visionary, a member of the Explorers Club EC50 class of 2022. Natalie is, and this is a title that needs some explanation, a holistic conservationist, geneticist, documentarian. Her work has taken her from the peaks of the Himalayas, looking for snow leopards, to the icy waters of Antarctica. And she's also engaged in some espionage, which we'll touch upon a little later. Welcome, Natalie. So good to see you, Dr. Natalie Schmitt.
Richard Weiss, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And wow, what an incredible introduction. I don't know what to say. I'm a little bit speechless.
Well, I find that it's interesting because one sees themselves as maybe they grew up and, you were Schmitty from Australia, right? That was what you'd go by, Nat. And so when people heap all these accolades, I think there's always a little bit of imposter syndrome or that whole idea of, are they talking about me?
Richard, that is me to a T. Like I have carried imposter syndrome my entire scientific career. I don't think it's ever going to go away, no matter what you achieve. And I think, to be honest, I think a lot of women carry this. Like it's so it's partly the fact that I'm female. It's partly the fact that I grew up in Australia, and us Australians, we have this whole thing around tall poppy syndrome. Like we don't like talking about ourselves and kind of big noting ourselves, and we don't really like other people doing it either. So yeah, it's a combination of a lot of things, I think.
I've noticed that syndrome, tall poppy, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, is that if somebody gets a little too big for their britches, they tend to get slapped down a peg or two. And what is it? I know that that's sort of a British quality, Australian quality. What is it about that? Why is that? Because in America, certainly it's the opposite. People are like, look at me, I am so wonderful.
I don't know. I think it's very much a British trait. And we all come from convicts in Australia, so it's I don't know what it is.
So, we were talking about the term conservation or conservationist. And you are a conservationist through and through. And, when you say it, you're a holistic conservationist. But for those of us who are not fully aware of that term, because it is kind of new, what does that mean?
So this is a term that I've developed for myself over the years I've been exploring conservation. So I'm first and foremost a conservation scientist, but I realized that successful conservation requires that we take a very holistic approach. So science is like one part of what makes conservation successful. The other parts are we need artists, we need journalists, we need politicians, we need economists, we need communities, we need everyday people. So conservation is so multifaceted. I don't feel right in calling myself a scientist, even though that's where I started from. But now, because I see that conservation requires this holistic approach, I'm exploring all these other avenues like art and film, and because they all have a very powerful part to play in conservation success.
Our mission is to empower the next generation of explorers. If you like this podcast, please recommend it to a friend and have them join the expedition. Well, it's kind of interesting because I think part of the issue with science right now is how we communicate it. I think everybody has this image of Indiana Jones, boots in the mud, male guy, and that's a scientist. And that not everybody, you and I, come from similar Western educated type people. So when we talk, we understand each other. You're from Australia. I've been there many, many times. They're Aboriginal people who speak an entirely different language in that they look at a tree or a rock and it means something so different than it does to us. So how do we get their voices or the inclusion of everybody's voice in this narrative? Because there seems to be a disconnect, again, when we use the term conservation.
Yeah, exactly. And I did some work recently, at the beginning of the year actually, with some First Nations trackers working on caribou. Like they helped us to find caribou activity from the air, and their knowledge about caribou and the nature that surrounds them was absolutely astounding. And it was like that moment I thought, my gosh, conservation, like indigenous knowledge is absolutely essential for conservation success. Us scientists have to work with indigenous people. So in North America, indigenous people have this concept of what they call two-eyed seeing, which means that there are many different ways that we can view the world. There's the indigenous way, and then there's the scientific way. And we really need to work together in order to see the world as a whole, right? But I want to take that one step further. So instead of two-eyed seeing, I see that we need multi-eyed seeing, because it's not just science and indigenous knowledge that's important. All of us have a role to play. Everyone that lives alongside nature, every single one of us has something to contribute. And I think it's so important that everyone has a voice when it comes to protecting our planet.
So where was your entry point towards science and nature? What most people I know that are involved with, especially big cat biology or even other mammals, it came from a love of animals. Was this something that grew up in the Schmitt family? Tell me about the Schmitt family down under.
The Schmitt family. So my dad loved camping, and he had this best mate who I called my uncle, and our families would get together and we'd go camping since I was the age of 3. And they are the happiest memories of my childhood. I can honestly, I have this vivid memory of lying on the ground in the Australian bush and just staring up at the treetops and feeling so incredibly safe, like feeling like I was a part of this big, beautiful family, feeling protected. And I was only like 5. And so I just fell in love with nature. And then, of course, you know, as many of us have, watching David Attenborough documentaries, BBC documentaries. I mean, yeah,
that's a high bar. That's a really, but but where the disconnect may be coming is that if you watch a David Attenborough or a Jane Goodall or any of these other famous conservationist scientists, it seems like it's just all happening at all times. And, you know, for example, we mentioned that you had done some work with snow leopards, which are considered like the most elusive of the cats up in the Himalayas. Is it all just sunsets and, you know, sitting there having communal responses to animals?
It's certainly not all that. I think you're referring to being a conservation scientist. For me, they are the highlights. I mean, that's what we live for as biologists. Like we live for the 1% of the time that we get to go to these incredibly phenomenal places and have these interactions with the most incredible animals. But most of the time, like every day after day, I'm in front of the computer. Like most of my time is spent in an office at a desk in front of a computer. So and with the world the way it is at the moment, it's a tough job being a holistic conservationist or a conservation or a biologist or anyone trying to protect our planet. It's not easy, but you've definitely got to have that love and that hope constantly driving.
But I mean, do you feel that in order to pursue this dream that maybe you had to give up on other dreams, compromise things, be placed, you know, live places maybe you didn't want to live? I mean, is this something that I'm making up, or is this indeed the case?
No, this is indeed the case. And it's not the case for everyone, but I know, with myself, I had to really give up the possibility of having a family, of having kids. As a woman pursuing what I'm pursuing, it's really challenging having both. It's not to say that you can't do it, but for me, that was going to be too challenging. And to do what I'm doing at the moment, I had to move to the other side of the world, away from my family and friends, to a little city that's not my ideal place to live in the world. And so it can be a really lonely journey at times, but I think always at the forefront is your heart that drives you. It's just, I don't know. I've just always felt that I'm on this mission. I don't know what that mission is exactly, but I'm just so kind of driven.
But Nat, you mentioned your childhood in Australia, and I was thinking of it. You really did paint a great picture of, there's something really great about lying on your back, looking up at the stars. I used to live in Australia for a very short time, and there's this sense of freedom that maybe America had 100, 200 years ago, because you really do have big empty spaces there. Do you feel sad that you're not there? I mean, couldn't you have done your work from there?
Yes,
I'm hitting some. I'm sorry to take you down this road, Matt.
No, not at all. Because this is the way it is. This is the journey for a lot of people. And yes, I am sad that I miss the Australian bush so much. It's where my heart is. It's where my soul is. It's obviously where my family and friends are. I miss nature so badly, because where I'm at, I live in a city, and it seems ironic that I'm a conservationist and I'm not spending enough time in nature. But I miss home really badly.
And you're going home shortly, right?
Yes, next week. Next week, after 2 years away, I get to spend a month with my family in Tasmania.
So your journey from the young girl, laying on her back, looking up at the stars, to being a doctor, a PhD, someone who people take seriously. it's been a little bit of a journey that's had some twists that wouldn't necessarily align with being a scientist. I know that you were a fashion model. You're on cover of magazines. You're in TV shows. I think you were in a soap opera. So, does
Yeah.
that world seem so far away? And while you were doing it, did you ever know that wasn't going to be your ultimate resting place?
That's an interesting question. I've had such an eclectic career, and I think it's because I'm just interested in so many different things. And I'm the type of person that I want to give things a go because you never know where it's going to lead. With the modeling career, that actually started out from my grandmother. So my grandmother used to be a model. She used to run her own agency. And I was this very shy teenager who lacked so much confidence. And
why did you lack confidence? Did someone in your life, did your parents certainly sound like they were present? So what was it that you didn't, believe that you were attracted enough to get paid for it?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know how to answer that. I think I've always struggled with lack of self-worth. And as a teenager, I just lacked so much confidence no matter what my parents tried. And so my grandmother thought, you know what, I think you could be a model. I'm going to get you into modeling. That's going to do so much for your confidence, right? And it did. Like, for a while, I mean, I managed to make a bit of a career out of it. I spent time in Sydney, did Fashion Week, traveled around the world with it, got to see some incredible places, meet some very interesting people. But it was kind of a temporary boost. And, as you can imagine, when you're so focused on the external all the time, that after a while it starts to become problematic. And so, there were positives about it, but there were certainly also negatives.
I mean, was your intelligence ever held against you? I mean, I think that there's this perception of models, sort of being there, not necessarily their opinion being respected. Did you find that there was that issue of the intellect screaming to come out while someone's saying, sweetie, just stand still?
Not really, because I knew, it wasn't something that I planned to continue for many years. It had its place. It served its purpose. It enabled me to travel. It earned me a bit of money, gave me a little bit of confidence. And interestingly, it opened the doors for me when it came to documentary film. Since watching David Attenborough documentaries, I thought, I want to be David Attenborough. Like, not literally, but I want to be like David Attenborough, and I want to inspire the world about nature, about wildlife. And when I was modeling, I was in a music video clip, and the director of that music video clip was also a director on wildlife documentaries. And I said to him, do you think I could audition for you and get into documentary filming? And he said, why not? You should audition for our production company, and the rest is kind of history.
How did you like that?
Documentary film?
Yeah.
I really loved it. I absolutely loved it. So I quit science for 5 years. Like, I had this opportunity in Sydney to present for it was a show called Animal Hospital, and they chose me as a presenter. And I thought, you know what? I think I'm actually pretty good at this presenting stuff. I'm gonna give this a go. And it was looking back on it was quite a bold move. Like, for me to say, you know what? I'm going to give up science for a while and see where this takes me, because I think at the time I was a bit frustrated with science. I felt that science was not doing enough to help. I wasn't doing enough to help. And I thought that by getting into documentary films or presenting, that I could have more of an influence, that I could have more of an impact. I mean, you know yourself with the profile that you have, like.
There's a double-edged sword to it. I think that I've become a little cynical of wildlife programming or adventure shows, because I think the temptation really is to go for the sensational. Whereas, to me, the best reality show is really happening. And so if you do a wildlife show, the expectation is that you always have to ratchet it up, and you can only go so far before you start really baking it. And so I think that that whole idea of the holistic, of including the local people in that kind of programming, is, to me, as interesting as just, fighting a snake. Or I remember being in the Northern Territory on the ground with a death adder. And now that sounds very heroic, but I know that it had just molted, so it wasn't really going to strike me. But, there's all of those behind the scene type things that, aren't necessarily completely honest, right? I think that's my gripe with that field.
And my gripe is exactly the same. I experienced exactly the same things, and I fought with directors over it because a lot of that sensationalism was not scientifically correct. And I argued that with science, you don't need sensationalism. So science is already fascinating as it is. And if we make a mistake as a scientist, what's wrong with revealing that on camera? Sorry, I made a mistake. We need to retest this. It's part of the whole process. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't like that sensationalism.
So we're the model. We're on there, the cool wildlife presenter. That's still a little bit of a gap between that and a PhD, because a PhD, I don't care where you get a PhD in what subject, it's a hell of a lot of work.
Yeah, it's tough. It's one of the biggest achievements, I think, that you can have in science. It's really tough. So I think, to your point, I got a bit sick of documentary film, and I thought, you know what? I think I want to go back and do my PhD now.
Wow.
So I was in Tasmania. I had just spent 2 years filming a documentary on Tasmanian devils and the facial tumor disease that has been killing them. And I was originally an animal behaviorist. So I used to work with marsupials around animal behavior. And I started to become really fascinated with genetics. So you can imagine genetics kind of advances really quickly. And I started to read scientific papers on genetic tools and how valuable they are with helping us learn more about rare and elusive species. And I thought, you know what? I think I want to do a PhD on genetics. And then in Tasmania, I happened to be very close to the Australian Antarctic Division. And it had always been a dream of mine to go to Antarctica. And there just happened to be a PhD project available on the population genetics of humpback whales. And I fought tooth and nail to get that PhD. They didn't want to give it to me because they said you haven't had any experience in genetics. I volunteered in a lab for 6 months to prove that I had the experience and the determination, and got that PhD, and yeah, the rest is history.
But, all of those things, I know they sound, to somebody listening, this is super cool. But I guess the piece that's not necessarily being revealed is the struggle. Because, if you were speaking to the 18-year-old Natalie Schmitt, what would you say to her? Because I think that it's not all that easy, and that, there is an emotional component of trying to achieve very high things that can sometimes be very isolating.
So I mentioned that I always had problems with lack of self-worth. And I found that in my early life, like all the way through my 20s, I found that it was that lack of self-worth that was driving me, in a sense, to want to overachieve, because unless I achieved, then I was not worthy. And that pushed me to a point where I ended up going through depression, and really, really dark depression. When I was filming in Tasmania was like the worst time of my life. And I decided at that point that I never wanted to experience this again. And so that's the point at which I decided I want to learn how to meditate.
Okay. And so do you think that now meditation in and itself seems like a pretty benign thing, right? It's something that you can do wherever you are, right? But does it take you to a whole other style of living or viewing things, or knowing that depression's coming on? I mean, I think you've taken it a little step further from just meditating.
So I decided to go on I don't know if the viewers have heard of Vipassana meditation and the silent retreats that you can do for 10 days. So these are 10-day completely silent retreats, so you can't speak. I went on this retreat, and Richard, it felt like I had come home. Like I felt like this is the answer to happiness. Like it just resonated with me so deeply that I was determined to continue this process. And I then proceeded to go and do 3-month silent retreats.
Oh my gosh.
3 months of complete silence.
That sounds horrible, actually.
It sounds horrible. It is the most challenging thing that I've ever done, because you are present with your mind constantly for that 3-month period. But what you learn about yourself and the way your mind works, it's as if you've become a scientific observer of your own mind. And so those retreats, and I'm not saying that anyone has to go to that length to change the chemistry of their brain, but what meditation has done for me, it's brought me more into the present moment. So rather than reacting to life based on what's happened in the past, my lack of self-worth, or worrying about what I don't have any control of in my future, I'm much more present. I'm much more really just open to anything that presents itself. And yeah, it completely transformed me. And so what it does, Richard, is it allows me to make decisions in my life that are much more grounded in love and compassion. Like truly, like we all think that we do things based on love and compassion, but
no, I don't. I'm half Sicilian.
Oh, okay.
And the Sicilian side of me wants to get even.
Yeah, right.
So this is a journey for me to hear this. Go ahead.
So I found that when you are more, and I'm by no means perfect. Like I slip all the time, but when you know that when you've made a decision that is based purely on compassion and love, there's this incredible amount of peace that goes with it. This peace, this freedom. And when you speak, you speak without being self-conscious, without being attached to ego. You speak from a place of love. And yeah, it was from that really started my journey here to Canada and the work that I'm currently doing now.
But let me ask you, you said you found out about yourself. So, I mean, is it possible for one to sort of in a sentence or two say, I found out that I was fill in the blank? I mean, or does it really found out that, this idea of openness or love and compassion? I think compassion is an underrated quality by many people. It's undervalued. So what is it that you found out about yourself?
I found out some very confronting things about myself that I didn't like. I found out that I can actually be very judgmental. I found that out about myself, and I didn't like it, but it's a part of me, and it's something that I'm now aware of.
I'm going to stop you on that one because I think I applaud you for saying not to be judgmental, because until you walk in somebody else's shoes, you don't want to be judgmental. You don't know what's happening in their life, right? But I do think that intelligence in society is being something that's almost being made fun of. And so I have to admit, I do feel judgmental about people who, I'll give you an idea on the environment. They'll say, oh, nuke the whales, right? That's their thumbing their nose at society and saying, screw that, drill, baby, drill. And I'm thinking, what a moron. I think what a moron. You don't think past just thumbing your nose and not caring what the consequences are. So I'm not entirely sure how you're using judgmental, because in that case, I'm very judgmental. Maybe I am more compassionate in other areas, but I think part of and if I may build you up here, Natalie, is you are a very attractive, intelligent woman, and that, your own personal standard is I think high, that, maybe it does, you look at people and say, gosh, why are you just sort of wasting away or not reacting to something? So I would give yourself a little bit of a break on that one.
So often judging others is based on a lack of understanding. So it's, like you say, it's very easy to point the finger at people and say, what are you doing? You're ridiculous. Like, why did you vote for this person? Blah, 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 blah. But until we, like you say, put ourselves in their shoes, truly understand where they're coming from, we can't really judge them for their actions. But if your judgment is informed, like you do truly understand the person, and they decide to do this anyway, then maybe it's justified. But yeah, I think a lot of judgment is based on a lack of understanding, and it can often be a reflection of ourselves, right? Like
God, Natalie, now you're making me feel bad. Like I feel like you're in the next branch of human evolution, and I'm this guy from Long Island, like is just thumbing his nose at people.
No.
Hey, we are running out of time, and I did mention something about espionage, and I just want to remind our viewers, in espionage, there are secrets. So just to give a little context from this, there is a person that we both know, a wildlife biologist, who was put in jail for 6 years in Iran and was released recently. And I don't know how you and I got into that conversation, but you told me that you were part of a group that was sort of underground trying to have this person released. You were working with Jane Goodall, I believe.
So yes, I guess it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now that a group of environmentalists in Iran were charged with espionage in using camera traps to study Asiatic cheetahs. The Revolutionary Guard in Iran thought that they were using the cameras for spying, and
they knew they weren't spies. I mean, I know this story. They knew they weren't spies. This was all about, money and retribution
and politics and everything. I mean, we of course knew that. So I'd never met these people, but I had friends who had worked with them, and I felt so much for their plight that I wanted to join these friends in finding a way of making their case, helping the world understand their case, and finding ways that we could basically get them out. So we formed this little group of people, and we've spent the last 5 years trying to get them out, and they're finally free.
Wow, we this whole arc, and this arc has to continue on, but it goes from little girl looking at the stars in the outback to cover girl to meditation, looking at snow leopards. Natalie, you have been on a hell of a journey, really a hell of a journey.
Yes, and it continues, Richard.
One last question. Someone who wants to do what you do, what's your advice?
Just follow your heart. Just that's all. Just whatever you love, just follow it.
I think that's good advice for anything. Natalie, thank you so much for being on, and thank you for taking us on part of your journey.
Oh, Richard, thank you so much for having me. This has been so enjoyable. I've loved every moment.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Now we have a little favor to ask. We'd really appreciate your support, so make sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another episode. See you out on the trail.